It was a cold November night in 1957 when Daniel Harper stepped aboard the overnight train from New York to Chicago. The station was almost empty. A thin mist floated beneath the yellow lamps, and the smell of coal smoke lingered in the air. Somewhere beyond the platform, a porter closed a heavy metal door, and the distant whistle of another train disappeared into the darkness. Daniel pulled his coat tighter around himself and checked his ticket. Car 7, seat 18. He climbed the narrow steps and entered the sleeping carriage. Inside, everything seemed quieter than the station. The soft golden lights above the seats made the polished wood glow warmly. A few passengers were already asleep, their heads resting against the windows. Others whispered over newspapers or stared silently into the darkness outside. Daniel walked down the aisle until he found his seat. But someone was already sitting beside the window. An elderly man. He looked to be somewhere in his 70s. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a dark brown suit that had clearly been carefully maintained for many years. A worn leather suitcase rested beside his shoes. The old man looked up. "You're Daniel, I suppose." Daniel stopped. "How did you know my name?" The man smiled. "It's written on your ticket." Daniel laughed softly. "Of course." He placed his suitcase above the seat and sat beside him. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The train began to move. Slowly at first. The station lights slipped past the window one by one. Then the train gathered speed, carrying them away from New York and into the sleeping countryside. Daniel watched the city disappear. Brick buildings became warehouses. Warehouses became small houses. And soon there was almost nothing outside except darkness, distant farm lights, and the occasional lonely road. The old man stared through the window. "My name is Samuel," he finally said. "Nice to meet you, Samuel." Samuel nodded. "Chicago?" "Yes." "Business?" Daniel hesitated. "Something like that." Samuel smiled again. "That usually means there's a story behind it." Daniel looked at him. Samuel kept looking at the photograph, as if the young woman in it might suddenly speak to him. Her name was Eleanor. In 1942, she was 24 years old, with dark brown hair, bright eyes, and a habit of humming whenever she was nervous. "I met her at a railway station," Samuel said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Of all places." Samuel nodded. "It was a rainy afternoon in Pennsylvania. I was 27 and had just returned from working in Ohio. My train was delayed for nearly 3 hours." He laughed softly. "I hated every minute of that delay." "But not anymore?" "No," Samuel said. "Not anymore." Eleanor had been sitting alone on a wooden bench, holding a small suitcase on her lap. She was waiting for her brother, who was supposed to arrive on the same train. He never did. Samuel remembered seeing her glance at the station clock again and again. Eventually, he asked if she needed help. She told him her brother had been called away unexpectedly. Then she smiled. That was how it began. Two strangers talking beneath a leaking station roof while rain tapped against the windows. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. About music. About books. About the places they wanted to see. And about the strange dreams people carried quietly inside themselves. When Samuel's train finally arrived, Eleanor looked at him and said, "I suppose this is goodbye?" Samuel replied, "Maybe not." He wrote his address on the back of his ticket. "Write to me." She did. The first letter arrived 12 days later. Then another. Then another. Their letters traveled back and forth across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. They slowly learned everything about one another. Eleanor loved roses but hated their thorns. Samuel loved winter mornings but disliked crowded cities. She wanted a little house with a porch. He wanted a workshop where he could build furniture. They began dreaming about the same future. Then America changed. In December 1941, the country entered the war. Samuel was drafted. The morning he left, Eleanor stood with him on the same platform where they had first met. She tried to be brave, but when the train began moving, she cried. Samuel pressed his hand against the glass. Samuel waited until the train left the tunnel before he continued. "There are some memories," he said quietly, "that never really grow old." Daniel looked toward him. Samuel's hands rested on his leather suitcase. "In 1945, I spent almost a year searching for Eleanor. I went back to the station where we first met. I visited her old neighborhood. I even traveled to Ohio because someone told me she had gone there. Did you find her? No. Samuel looked out the window. Eventually, I stopped searching. Outside, the landscape had changed completely. The crowded towns of the east were far behind them. Now there were wide fields beneath a silver moon, occasional barns and long stretches of empty road. The train moved steadily through the sleeping Midwest. I was angry, Samuel continued. Not at Eleanor. At myself. He believed he had made one terrible mistake. He had waited for her, but perhaps she had been waiting for him too. I started thinking that maybe one of my letters had never reached her. Daniel frowned. Did you keep copies? Everyone. Samuel opened his suitcase. Inside were dozens of envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Some were yellow with age, some had torn corners. Daniel stared at them. You kept all of these? I couldn't throw them away. Samuel untied the ribbon and removed one envelope. This one was returned to me. He turned it over. The address was Eleanor's old home. Across the front was a red postal stamp. Return to sender. Daniel felt a strange sadness. Why didn't you send it again? I did. Samuel pulled out another envelope. And another. There were 6 returned letters. Daniel looked at him. Maybe she moved. She did. Then maybe someone knew where she went. Samuel nodded. That is what I thought. He reached into the suitcase again. This time he pulled out a small newspaper clipping. The paper was brittle and brown. Daniel read the headline. Local family leaves town after tragedy. Below it was a short article about Eleanor's father. He had died unexpectedly in an industrial accident. The family had sold their house soon afterward. Eleanor had left town with her mother. No new address was listed. Samuel was silent for a long time. The train moved steadily through the darkness, its wheels creating a soft rhythm that seemed almost like a lullaby. Daniel watched him hold the old envelope. What happened after you received her letter? He finally asked. Samuel looked down. I searched again. For Eleanor? For 20 years. He explained that he had written to every address mentioned in her letter. He contacted old neighbors, railway workers, even people who had once worked with her father. But every path ended in silence. Then, in 1963, Samuel received a second letter. This one came from a small town in Illinois. The writer was a woman named Margaret. She had been Eleanor's closest friend when they were young. Margaret explained that Eleanor had moved to Chicago after her mother's death. She had found work at a small library. And she had never married. Samuel's voice became softer. I thought that was it. I thought I had finally found her. So you went to Chicago? Yes. Daniel smiled. But she wasn't there. Samuel shook his head. She had left 3 weeks earlier. For where? She didn't say. Samuel laughed quietly, though there was no happiness in it. Life has a strange sense of humor. Daniel looked through the window. The scenery had become more industrial now. Small towns appeared more frequently. Factory lights glowed in the distance and tall smokestacks rose against the night. Samuel continued. Margaret gave me something. He reached into his suitcase. It was a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. Eleanor stood beside a little boy. Daniel studied the picture. Her son? Samuel nodded. My son. Daniel froze. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Samuel stared at the photograph. I didn't know he existed. Daniel looked at the old man. Eleanor never told you? She tried. Samuel's voice trembled. She wrote to me. He pulled another envelope from the wooden box. This letter was sent in 1948. Daniel looked at the date. Samuel continued. She told me she had given birth to a boy. She named him Michael. She said she wanted me to meet him. Then what happened? Samuel swallowed. The letter was sent to an address I had left 2 years earlier. Daniel understood. Another letter. Another missed chance. Another piece of a life lost because 2 people were separated by circumstances neither could control. Samuel looked down at his hands. By 3 a.m, most of the passengers were asleep. The lights inside the carriage had been dimmed, and the sound of the train seemed softer than before. Daniel remained awake. Across from him, Samuel sat quietly with his leather suitcase on his knees. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Daniel asked, What will you say to him? Samuel looked down. I don't know. You've had 40 years to think about it. Samuel smiled sadly. That's the problem. 40 years gives a man too many words. He opened his suitcase. Inside was a small wooden box. Samuel lifted the lid. There was a photograph of Eleanor, several old letters, and a tiny silver ring. I bought this in 1945, he said. Daniel looked at it. For Eleanor? Samuel nodded. I carried it through half my life. Why didn't you sell it? Samuel closed the box. Because some things aren't worth money. Outside, the darkness was beginning to change. The black sky had become a deep blue. Far away, the first pale light of morning touched the horizon. They were getting close to Chicago. Samuel looked nervous. Daniel could see his hands trembling. What if Michael doesn't forgive you? Samuel took a slow breath. Then I will accept it. What if he doesn't believe you? Then I'll show him the letters. What if he doesn't want to know you? Samuel looked out the window. Then I will walk away. There was sadness in his voice, but also peace. I've spent too many years wishing I could change yesterday, he said. Now I only want to be honest about today. The train entered the outskirts of Chicago. Factories appeared beside the tracks. Rows of small houses stood beneath the fading night. Streetlights reflected against wet pavement. The great city slowly awakened. Daniel suddenly remembered his own reason for coming. His father's letter. He reached into his coat and touched the envelope. For the first time, he wondered what could possibly be inside it. Samuel noticed. You haven't opened it? No. Michael stood quietly in front of Samuel. Neither father nor son seemed to know what to say. The great station moved around them. Porters pushed luggage carts across the floor. Trains hissed beneath the morning light. Hundreds of strangers hurried toward their own destinations. But for Samuel, the world had become completely still. Michael held the photograph in his hands. On the back, Eleanor had written a short message. I hope one day you will understand that your father never left us by choice. If you ever find him, please tell him I waited. Samuel closed his eyes. A tear rolled slowly down his cheek. I never knew, he whispered. Michael nodded. I know. For a moment, Samuel looked frightened. I have so much to explain. Michael looked at him. You don't have to explain everything today. Samuel opened his eyes. Michael continued. Mom kept your letters. Samuel's breath caught. All of them? All of them. Michael reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle tied with blue ribbon. The same blue ribbon Samuel had used decades earlier. She told me about you, Michael said. Not every detail, but enough. Samuel touched the letters with trembling fingers. I thought you hated me. Michael smiled sadly. I can't hate someone I never knew. Those words broke something inside Samuel. He stepped forward. For a second, he hesitated. Then Michael opened his arms. Samuel embraced his son. It was not the embrace of two strangers. It was the embrace of two people who had spent 40 years looking for a missing piece of the same life. Daniel stood nearby, watching silently. He suddenly remembered his own father's letter. He took it from his pocket. The envelope was old, but the handwriting was clear. Daniel finally understood why his father had told him not to open it until Chicago. He carefully opened it. Inside was a single page. My son, it began, if you are reading this, I am no longer there to explain what I should have told you long ago. I spent most of my life believing that being strong meant keeping pain to myself. I was wrong. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. His father had written about mistakes, missed chances, and the people he had loved but never properly thanked. At the bottom were 3 simple sentences. Do not wait too long to say what matters. Do not let pride speak louder than love. And if someone you love is waiting for you, go to them. Daniel folded the letter. Across the platform, Samuel was speaking quietly with Michael. The old man noticed Daniel. Their eyes met. Samuel smiled. You opened it. Daniel nodded. Samuel understood. Then perhaps, he said, this train brought both of us where we needed to be. Outside the station, morning sunlight began spreading across Chicago. Daniel picked up his suitcase. Samuel offered his hand. Daniel shook it. Thank you, Daniel said. Samuel smiled. No, thank you for listening. Daniel walked toward the station exit. Behind him, Samuel and Michael stood together beneath the great glass roof. A father, a son, 2 lives finally reunited. And as Daniel stepped into the morning air, he realized something he would never forget. Sometimes life separates people not because love was weak, but because time was cruel. Sometimes letters arrive too late. Sometimes trains leave before we are ready. But every once in a while, life gives us another platform. Another morning. Another chance to say the words we should have said long ago. Years later, Daniel would still remember that winter journey from New York to Chicago. He would remember the rain against the window, the quiet fields beneath the moon, the old photograph, and the gentle voice of a stranger telling him about a love that survived 40 years of silence. Whenever Daniel traveled by train after that, he would sit beside the window, and whenever the night became quiet, he would think of Samuel. Then he would whisper the same words his father had written. Don't wait too long to say what matters. Outside the window, America would continue moving beneath the stars. And somewhere in that endless darkness, another train would be carrying another traveler toward another beginning.